The Black Death had given birth to a terrifying monster. When the city of the lilies had fallen, the squabbling factions became frightened of what would come next. The Doge was unable to resist, beaten by an overwhelming and devoted force. The Pope himself was forced to bend the knee. The Viper had sunk its fangs throughout all of Italy, but would the serpent continue tightening its grip or unravel into chaos? Welcome to History's Influence. Before we begin, we've nearly reached 5,000 subscribers. Please like and subscribe to help us reach the goal. Once we hit the goal, I'll be launching the channel's Discord server. Now, on to the video. What began in the Republic of Florence had spread throughout all of Italy, and to a lesser extent all over Europe. The Renaissance was a transformative period of cultural, social, and technological revival, broadly placed between the late 1300s to early 1600s. During this period, Italy was divided into numerous competing city-states. They would eventually come under foreign domination following the Italian Wars, only unifying under an independent government by 1861. But what if one of these states had overcome their rivals in an attempt to unify Italy during the Renaissance? Would they be successful? How would they manage the peculiarities of the different states and their peoples? Would Italy go on to form a global superpower? Or would they fall to foreign occupation before being able to do so? All these questions and more will be answered in this alternate history. The idea of a unified Italy was not a 19th century invention, or a unique feature of the Roman Empire. In the 9th century, you have Colar di Rienzo, de facto ruler of the city of Rome. He attempted and called for a unification of the peninsula, although his attempt was an utter failure. In the 13th century, the famous Florentine scholar Petrarch wrote a poem named Italia Mia. It was a call to action to remove the foreigners from Italy and to establish sovereignty over the peninsula. Virtue against fury shall take up arms, and the fight be short, for ancient valour is not dead in Italian hearts. Machiavelli quoted this same passage near the end of The Prince, calling for the Medici family of Florence to unify Italy and expel the foreign warmongers. Speaking more broadly, Italy held a distinct geographical boundary with the Alps, with the cultural and linguistic groups which were unique to the peninsula. But politically, Italy hadn't been unified since the 6th century under the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian. Germanic barbarians and Eastern Romans ruled portions of the peninsula for centuries. By 960, northern Italy was conquered by what would become the German-led Holy Roman Empire, but the emperors of the HRE never held firm control over Italy. They were often forced to reassert dominance through incursions, but the control of northern Italy continued to reduce over the centuries. Emperors would also battle with the Pope's influence in Italy, primarily through the Guelph and Ghibelline conflict. Many of the small Italian states would play off both sides to increase their autonomy. The emperor eventually became unable to appoint bishops or abbots, with the papacy acquiring such power. This was important. You see, bishops often held control of important urban regions through tax, land rights, and trade. Ancient cities such as Florence or Milan had survived from Roman times and began to recover to ancient Roman population numbers. The Po Valley was very agriculturally efficient, so less people were required to farm. By the 1100s, northern Italy was the most urbanized area in Europe, with about 20% of the population living in urban areas. The noble elites of rural lands were oppressive, causing peasants to flee to the opportune cities. The nobles would then come to the cities themselves to be near the centres of power. The urban bishops, dukes, etc. would gradually lose their power to the citizenry, often with consuls elected by popular assembly taking charge. With increasing urban growth, further specialisation occurred through artisans, the manufacturing of specialised goods, and the increase of resource extraction needed for such goods. Artists, merchants, administrators, lawyers, and other such roles became the backbone of new communal institutions. You also have trading republics being established earlier in the 9th century. They would trade Middle Eastern goods for marked up prices to Europe. This gave great wealth to these cities, without the interference of powerful feudal noblemen. They even had established standardized currencies for a more efficient trade. Landlords had begun to demand coins instead of crops throughout all of Italy, increasing the demand and usage of currency. Trading influence also spread throughout Italy. Florence, for example, had become a key trading centre. Their city would primarily build their wealth from cloth manufacturing. They had their own currency, joint stock companies, and were the first to invent double-entry bookkeeping in the world. They used government debt and established insurance schemes as well. It was a time of prosperity. Broadly in Europe, the population was booming, from 20 million in the 1200s to 70 million by 1350. The subsequent Black Death was a touch displeasing, killing a third to half of the European population. But it also helped contribute to the urbanization of North Italy. People saw higher food surpluses, higher wages since there weren't as many workers, and more luxuries available proportionate to the population. It's not like the luxuries disappeared with the people. This was followed again with population growth, but from a base of more entrenched communal institutions. This is the backdrop by which Italy never unified during the Renaissance. The campanile, city-based loyalties, would strengthen during the Renaissance, but they would develop into larger power blocks with dynastic rule. Political and cultural differences were exacerbated by geographical barriers as well, particularly through the Apennine mountain range. Professional mercenaries would fight petty conflicts too, disloyal to any particular state. You also have southern Italy being a united kingdom but under foreign occupation. So eventually, for these reasons and more, most of the peninsula became subjugated by foreign powers, with professional armies bringing brutal and overwhelming force. As a result, Italy remained divided for centuries. So, how are we going to attempt to unify Italy during the Renaissance, given this entrenched backdrop? By the early 1400s, the medieval communes had begun to transition into what is called the Italian Signora. Citizen-elected leadership was transitioning to dynastic rule, although the dynamic of power differed for each region. The competing states eventually entered a relatively stable balance of power, demonstrated for example through the Treaty of Lodi in 1454. But things were different about a century earlier. The Black Death left the Lordship of Milan relatively unscathed, thanks to ruthless quarantining methods. This gave the Milanese a competitive edge against their opponents, beginning a wave of expansion. They were led by the Visconti dynasty, known as the Vipers of Milan by their enemies in Florence. Under the capable Gian Galeazzo Visconti, the Lordship of Milan had been upgraded to the Duchy of Milan, a title granted by the Holy Roman Emperor. His major ambition was to rule a powerful northern Italian kingdom. He was greatly successful in this endeavour, conquering numerous city-states. By 1402, he was sieging his primary opponent of Florence. No one else was standing in his way towards domination, but he happened to die of an illness during the siege. His 13-year-old son and new ruler struggled to secure power, and the numerous cities Jean conquered fell out of Milanese control, only to be beaten back further by the Republic of Venice. So, to try to have Italy unified during the Renaissance, we will assume Jean does not contract an illness during the siege and successfully captures Florence. The great wealth of Florence and the removal of his primary opponent would greatly strengthen Jean's duchy. I believe the imbalance of power created by Milan's conquest of Florence would create a self-perpetuating feedback loop of conquest. The Milanese would become by far the most powerful mainland Italian state, and so would continue conquering their neighbours. It's important to note that this period came before the Italian Wars, in which foreign powers such as France, Austria and Spain became directly involved in Italian affairs, starting in 1494. This will give Milan ample time, about a century, to expand and consolidate without substantial foreign intervention. But for Milan to be successful, they will need to stop being over-reliant on the condottieri, the Italian mercenaries of the period. They were loyal to coin, not king, and in the case of Milan, eventually overthrew the Visconti dynasty. They also betrayed Milan for France during the Italian Wars. A levy-based army would be formed out of necessity to fulfill the needs of Milan's continuous expansion and consolidation. Milan was not merely a competing city-state, it was becoming a regional hegemon. There would be too much risk of the cities revolting otherwise. Reliable levies would be needed to maintain discipline and control of their territories, through garrisons for control and an army to be called for times of war. These would provide centralizing institutions, weakening the local authority of the independent-minded cities. Milan would have a large population pool to draw upon with their expanding realm as well. Their reliance on mercenaries will reduce with time as a result. But what of their army's quality? They will need to accompany for the technology and tactics from foreign armies, particularly the French, Spanish, Swiss, etc., to survive in the long run. Machiavelli claimed that Italians were better at skirmishes and small-scale conflicts, but failed against national-scale warfare, due to being smaller bands of mercenaries and such. So, I believe being forged through local conflict and later foreign conflict, the Milanese army will prove competent enough to defend Italy's interests. The Milanese will also need to be effective administrators. Luckily, Gian Galeazzo fits the bill. Examples of his wise policy would include ordering senior officials to study economics and other related subjects for a well-ordered duchy. In fact, Milan's treasury actually expanded despite their constant warfare. Canals were dug and extended for inland transportation and irrigation for their expanded realm. Streets were paved, arcades built, and other architectural developments occurred. A postal service was established. Medical services and quarantine measures continued to be improved upon. Slot machines were also installed into each city they held, allowing thousands of dedicated players to make fortunes. Alright, maybe that last one isn't true. These unifying institutions, alongside the military, will help weaken city-based loyalties and institutions, the main obstruction Milan will face in their pursuit of northern Italian unification. This wasn't an issue exclusive to Milan. Florence, for example, struggled to keep hold of Pisa, who used to be the centre of a wealthy maritime republic. Although historically, these cities would eventually come under the thumb of external leadership, through more powerful city-states or from foreign rule. This was done through organised military force, as Milan in this new timeline will be able to assert. They will also have the benefit of a shared linguistic, religious, cultural, and potentially later a political identity as Catholic Italians, which foreign powers could not match with their occupations. Architecture will be built in these new locations, as Jean ordered historically. An aristocracy will naturally form from these conquests. Milanese appointed barons and other such roles will need to be filled in order to manage their new territories effectively. Similar to what the Venetians would do, these Milanese aristocrats will create estates in newly conquered land, helping cement control through aristocratic colonization. Their newfound wealth and power will make this inevitable, alongside Renaissance Italy's penchant for impressive architecture, whose precedent already existed by this point. It would serve as a small-scale version of the patronage we see from the city-states of Renaissance Italy. But this will take time to develop. Venice was a trading power with an entrenched elite for centuries, whereas Milan had only been declared a duchy in 1395. Gian Galeazzo will also need to secure his title's succession. We will assume that Jean has at least 10 to 15 more years from his death in 1402. He was 50 when he passed away. This will give time and focus for his two mentally troubled heirs. Jean married his first cousin, so they were the product of incest, to sire a male heir, which they were unable to do historically. The Milanese state would be on good footing, so their questionable leadership won't stop the Milanese boulder from rolling down the hill. This means the Sforza dynasty won't succeed them. The Sforza, after all, started as condottieri, who won't be as influential in Milan in this new timeline. With Milan following the developments we have described, the world would be their oyster, or at least the Italian peninsula. With the successful capture of Florence, their independent republic will be abolished. Republican propaganda, touted by Leonardo Bruni, saw the lifting of the 1402 siege as a special victory. You see, ancient Greek/Roman democracy had prevailed over Roman Empire-style autocracy. But the Vipers of Milan were not truly tyrants, as explained by the administrative reforms Jean implemented historically. The reality was a lot muddier in Florence itself as well. The Ciompi revolt saw conflict between unrepresented workers and privileged guild members who held governmental power. This war of representation lasted from 1378 to 1382, and in the 1400s, the Medici banking family would go on to become hereditary rulers, despite their humble public image, and later would become actual monarchs. Florence also had a short theocracy phase under the apocalyptic preacher Savonarola from 1494 to 1498. So, whilst Florence would need to be treated with care, they will eventually be integrated into the Milanese fold. After all, most of their higher forms of cultural and republican expression would not have existed yet. Their independent-mindedness had not reached its true zenith. The smaller states surrounding Florence had already submitted to Milanese rule. Within decades or less, condottieri-led regions such as Ferrara would be conquered with relative ease. The Pope would be too weak to resist such movements on their nominal land by this point. A smaller state Milan would have issues with would be the trading Republic of Genoa. It seems that the French dominated the city after 1394, with the Visconti taking power in 1409, but these weren't outright conquests. In this new timeline, Genoa will fall under Milanese control during Jean's reign, which would still fit this time frame. It's going to take some time for Genoa to become properly integrated into the kingdom. Given their pre-existing Mediterranean colonies and trading power, they would be difficult to rein in. France would have to be kept in check, but there's a plan later we'll be discussing to resolve that issue. The Maritime Republic of Venice will instead prove a troublesome foe for Milan. Venice was a very stable nation, a republic with wealthy families in stable oligarchic control, with a respectable trading empire. Much of this empire was gained after their acquisitions from the treacherous Fourth Crusade against their prior Byzantine overlords. I still haven't gotten over it myself. Anyway, they also had a highly profitable glassmaking industry. In our own timeline, Venice began to make substantial Italian incursions in 1404, only 2 years after Gian Galeazzo's death. This terra firma came at the great expense of Milan, thanks to doges such as Francesco Foscari pushing for expensive wars of aggressive expansion. But in this new timeline, Milan will become much more powerful, causing a protracted conflict with Venice. This would prove problematic for Venice. They were never fully able to commit to Italy or their trading empire at the same time. Additionally, Venice's historical over-reliance on the costly condottieri will be outmatched through the heavier usage of levies of Milan. So by the mid-1400s, Venice will be relegated to their maritime empire, but remain independent. The island city of Venice could be easily defended with their impressive navy. The Milanese wouldn't have really had a navy to speak of by this point. The Papal States, the lands held by the Catholic Pope, were in disarray during Gian Galeazzo's reign. The city of Rome had been degraded for centuries, dominated by the local noble families such as the Colonna or Orsini. The Western Schism, lasting from 1378 to 1417, saw 2 and later 3 popes claim the title of pope, weakening church authority. We will assume the schism still ends in the same fashion, but even when the schism ended, the Pope had to contend with the power of the ecumenical councils in the Church. Their power was placed above the Pope to prevent schisms happening into the future. Only during the High Renaissance, particularly from the 1490s onwards, do you see popes from families such as the Bourgeois or Medici extending the religious and secular power of the papacy. This will not have happened yet in the early to mid-1400s. Their lands, particularly in the autonomous Romagna region, will be easy pickings for the Milanese. It's true in our own timeline that Venice could conquer the city of Ravenna from the papacy, and I don't think Milan would struggle to take Ferrara for example, but Milan conquering the entirety of the Papal States would be far more controversial. To avoid the complete ire of Catholic Europe, the Milanese will negotiate an arrangement with the Pope. They would help strengthen papal authority against ecumenical councils, restoring their position of spiritual prominence. The Pope also won't be flinged to Avignon. They fell under the influence of the French king there beforehand during the schism. They would be dealing with the same problem, just from a different secular leader. The Holy Roman Emperor, in the early to mid-1400s, would also be too preoccupied to intervene. The efforts to resolve the Western Schism, the Hussite Wars in modern Czechia, the continuing fragmentation of Germany, and the growth of the Ottomans would be key concerns. In fact, during 1401 in our own timeline, the Emperor Rupert actually tried to crush Gian Galeazzo's rule, but was defeated and had to flee. Whoops. They would also welcome the weakening of the independent Venice, and the papacy may be brought into the Holy Roman fold through Milanese rule. So, after some conflict, a compromise will be reached with the emperors. The Duke of Milan will remain subservient to the Holy Roman Empire, but be given a new title within the empire. They would be recognized as the Kings of Italy. Rome will become the capital of this new Italian kingdom. This would help keep the secular power of the papacy in check, as they would literally be inhabiting the same city. This would also weaken the city's local nobles, who will be expelled by the nascent regime. So there we have it, a unified Italian state during the Renaissance. This attempt seems to have been a success, with the creation of a stable northern Italian kingdom. But would they be able to unite the rest of the peninsula, both politically and culturally? Would the Renaissance have been killed in its infancy? And what about the geopolitical ramifications for Europe, alongside the rest of the world through colonization? All these questions and more will be answered in part 2. This has been History's Influence. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, comment and subscribe. Catch you later.